It's a little windy today, and so I'm using this little microphone. So hopefully that's okay. So I just wanted to welcome some new subscribers to the channel. I don't know if you heard EJ from Luna Oi and Non-Compete on YouTube give Faint Signals from Vega a shout out.
Before that, little shout out to a channel called Faint Signals from Vega. They watch the channel a lot, and they talk a lot of different stuff. And apparently they have also gotten screwed by the algorithm.
Yes, yes, I remember this. Yes.
Anyway, they've been supporting us for a long time, and just asked for a little support because they say they're getting suppressed. They do a lot of vegan content. To be honest, I haven't dug in a lot yet, but they've been around for a long time. So we're going to share the link to that.
Cool, correct.
I'm not sure exactly where you may have heard about the channel, but anyway, welcome, and I hope that you find some of the content interesting. And I wanted to just quickly talk about Ron DeSantis. I think he may be the quote-unquote competent fascist that people have been talking about, that is probably going to be the president of the United States in 2024. It seems like he has probably CIA connections. When he was, I think when he was in Iraq, he basically, nobody really knows what he was up to, but most of the leaders that are in Florida tend to have strong CIA connections, and I just wouldn't be surprised if Ron DeSantis, if Trump doesn't end up winning, Ron DeSantis probably will, unless of course some other crypto fascist or straight up fascist joins the race in 2024. But one thing is for sure, it's very unlikely that the other awful party, the other warmongering party, the Democrats, it's unlikely that whoever they put forward, and it's probably going to be Biden again, that they will win. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that it looks like he has heavy CIA connections, Ron DeSantis, and I think he would do the bidding of the U.S. national security state, the military-industrial complex, and the capitalist class. He'd do their bidding very well. So, and minority groups and LGBTQ people are going to have a hell of a time. Anyway, also, I wanted to share something at another stage of what EJ and Luna were talking about today on their channel in a live stream about Oklahoma and trans rights. So anyway, I think it's Oklahoma. Anyhow, so I wanted to share this with you by Ali Abunimah from the Electronic Intifada. It's about Ukraine and well, I'm going to say it because YouTube always suppresses me anyway, so what does it matter? But the Nazi problem they have in Ukraine. And he talks about, he's not saying that 40 million people or whatever are Nazis, but there is definitely a Nazi problem in Ukraine. And they have a sort of a love, there's a certain amount of a love of Stefan Banderas, who's an actual Nazi and did all sorts of atrocities to Jews in Ukraine. And he was, literally associated with Hitler. And there's there's statues to him in Ukraine, and there's, streets named after him, and it's sort of a bit of a problem, to say the least. And that's sort of why I think 20% of the Azov battalion is Nazi. It's a bit of a shit show, one could say, in Ukraine. So anyway, Ali Abunimah talks about Stefan Banderas and talks about the problem the problems of Nazism in Ukraine, and it's very interesting. The whole video, in fact, the whole discussion at the Electronic Intifada about that, it's about an hour long, is actually really interesting. And I've just taken some snippets of what Ali Abunimah was saying. Not that the other two people in that discussion weren't saying interesting things, but I thought that Ali has this way of kind of bringing it all together, and so I wanted to share this with you. If I find a particular interview about the recent coup in Pakistan, getting rid of Imran Khan, and it's obviously US-backed, and there's a great outcry about it in Pakistan, and yet, you won't be seeing the outcry. There's thousands and thousands of people coming out in protest of the removal of Imran Khan, and but you won't be seeing that much on corporate media. Anyway, the US, as usual, while they're trying to overthrow Russia with all these sanctions, which is out of the US imperialist playbook, they've just overthrown the government of Pakistan. I mean, you know, it's a full-time job for those CIA folks, just sort of organizing coups left and right. It never ends. And if you've seen my recent video, the U.S. Imperialist master list of all the countries that the U.S. has overthrown or attempted to overthrow since World War II, it's a long list, and it just is so many different countries, and sometimes repeatedly, you know, like Bolivia, repeatedly trying to overthrow, and same with Venezuela. I mean, some of these countries are constantly dealing with meddling of one kind or another from the U.S. empire. The sooner the empire falls, the better for all of us. All I can say is that, you know, it really, really is at the center of most of the violence in the world today. And I don't think that the attempted coup of Russia is going to be successful, because Russia has the strong allyship with China and Iran and some other countries who are all in the crosshairs of U.S. empire. So these sanctions tend to backfire over and over again. The U.S. tries to cripple and destroy countries through sanctions, which are an act of war, and yet it always tends to have the opposite effect. It actually strengthens the resolve of the country against the U.S. You know, it is the case that the U.S. is not going to accept that it is a multipolar world, that it cannot be the dominant hegemon anymore, and that is something that I worry about, because I think the U.S. might get so desperate, and you know, the thought of not being the dominant hegemon, to not be have full spectrum dominance in the world today, I think it might even prefer to go out in a mushroom cloud than actually fall. That's my concern with the U.S. at this point, because I think it can see its grip slipping. Even Israel is questioning how the U.S. has just abandoned Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is just cannon fodder for the U.S. empire, really, in this war with Russia, and just throwing weapons at them, basically, which will have to be replaced, and the weapons industry will be rubbing their hands together. But literally, Victoria Nuland is going around Europe trying to get different countries to send weapons to Ukraine. Now, this is how disgusting. I mean, they're not even trying, as you would expect, since they helped create this with NATO expansion to Russia's borders, causing an existential threat. But then, you know, they're not even trying to do any sort of diplomacy, but you wouldn't expect the U.S. to do that. So anyway, it's just you know, the U.S. I think, realizes that its days are numbered, and it's like a wounded monster thrashing about and overstretched, and it is seeing that it's losing its grasp, and that can mean something very dangerous for the rest of the world. Hopefully, it won't be mutually assured destruction, but you know, I don't know how sort of unhinged these Pentagon folks are, and some of the folks in Congress. So anyway, I'll show you this by Ali Abunimah, and I think that you will find it very informative, and I will leave a link. I hope I remember to leave a link in the information section of this video so you can watch the whole thing. The whole thing is very informative about Ukraine, and the whitewashing also of Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, the West is just cheering on the funding of these Nazis. It's just disgusting, this sort of the whitewashing of Nazis. It's like the moderate rebels, in quotes, in Syria, who were Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and all of that. There was funding of those groups, and those groups have actually traveled to Ukraine to join in. So that's just marvelous. Anyway, so thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for this next segment.
Especially so when the brand of Ukrainian nationalism that has been aggressively promoted since 1991, when Ukraine became independent, when the Soviet Union fell apart, but especially since 2014, has been the most extreme right-wing form of nationalism you can imagine. We've all seen these discussions online where you know, people are saying the Azov Battalion, this group that was part of you know, the right-wing coup in 2014, the US-backed coup, that they're Nazis, that they use SS symbols, that they openly hero worship Hitler and all of that stuff. And you'll see people saying, well, the Azov Battalion, it's just like a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people. You can't, you know, as if just a few Nazis is okay. But all right, let's take that for the sake of argument. Well, it's just a few Nazis. That's not the point here. the point is that the nationalist cult that the Ukrainian state has nurtured since 2014 is the cult of Stepan Bandera. And who was Bandera? He was a committed ideological Nazi, Western Ukrainian nationalist Nazi, who openly collaborated with Hitler. And the Banderite organizations, the organization he founded, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, were active participants in the Holocaust, in the murder of thousands of Jews, of Poles, and these were committed Nazis, very committed ideological Nazis who were tools of the SS. And in fact, and then members of Banderite's group were directly placed under the control of the SS, were attacking Jews, carrying out the pogroms for the Nazis and all of that. And then they went off and formed another group called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known by its Ukrainian officials as UPA. The UPA went off and they were so brutal and savage to the Jewish population in Western Ukraine that Jews went to the Germans for protection. The Nazis were protecting Jews from the UPA. And today, you see the UPA flag in pro-Ukrainian marches everywhere in the West, in Chicago, in Toronto. In fact, Chrystia Freeland, the Canadian Deputy Foreign Minister, was photographed with the UPA flag, and then she had to, and she posted it on Twitter herself and had to take it down. And we see in Chicago the Illinois Ukrainian Society, because there's a fairly large Ukrainian diaspora in Chicago and Illinois. They have a day to honor the UPA. They have an annual commemoration to honor the UPA. It's on the Ukrainian American Society, or whatever the name of the organization is that operates in Ukraine, in Illinois. And so in order to whitewash, in order to make this palatable, this present-day cult of Nazis, and to make it compatible with this simplistic liberal media story of, the evil Russians and the good Ukrainians, you have to hide or whitewash the history. And so that's what I wrote about recently, about how literally, Hitler's accomplices, Stepan Bandera, whose image is all over Ukraine now, huge banners, statues in every major city. Kiev renamed its Moscow Avenue that leads to the Baba Yar Holocaust Memorial. They renamed it in 2016 Stepan Bandera Avenue by an overwhelming vote of the Kiev City Council. There are statues, huge monuments to Stepan Bandera in Ternopil in the west of Ukraine, in Lviv, in other cities. And in order to normalize this, you have to whitewash Bandera. And the piece I wrote for EI earlier this month was about how the Anti-Defamation League, a premier Israel lobby group that masquerades as an organization fighting anti-Semitism, put out an article whitewashing Bandera and saying, oh, well, the Banderites just made it was just a tactical alliance with Hitler. They didn't mean it. They were only murdering Jews because it was tactical. I mean, as if that would make a difference. But, of course, it wasn't just tactical. These were ideologically committed Nazis. And that's who the West, the so-called West, the democracy-loving West, are supporting today. The political heirs of Stepan Bandera and Hitler's accomplices. And let's just be clear. I just want to be clear about one thing. I'm not saying that, all 40 million people in Ukraine are Nazis. Of course not. What I'm saying, and what is the fact, is that the political forces sponsored by the West, who today dominate the Ukrainian state, are Nazis, or people who worship or have this cult of personality of Stepan Bandera. It's not just a few Azov battalion people. This is a cult of Hitler accomplice Stepan Bandera that is at the heart of 2022 Ukrainian ultranationalism that is being fully supported by the so-called West while they crow about democracy and human rights and apple pie and all of that stuff.
So how can Ukraine be Nazi? The president is Jewish. What do you make of that? And
how can Ukraine have a Nazi problem when its president is Jewish? I've seen, none other than Katerina von Schnellbein, the EU's so-called anti-Semitism coordinator, making that point on Twitter. In other words, using Zelensky's Jewish identity to whitewash the Bandera cult, to whitewash the cult of the Hitler accomplice who murdered and whose acolytes and whose supporters murdered so many Jews in Ukraine. And to me, that's Holocaust. It's Holocaust revisionism by the so-called anti-Semitism coordinator of the European Union, who's admonishing us day and night, never again, and we remember and don't forget, and we have to fight Holocaust revisionism. And these very same people, April is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and these same people who are whitewashing Nazis in Ukraine and whitewashing Stepan Bandera and his murderous Hitler accomplice supporters, in a couple of weeks are going to be, giving us pious lectures about never again, and we have to learn the lessons from history. The mind boggles. The mind really boggles. But the claim that Zelensky is Jewish, so how can there be a Nazi problem in Ukraine, is much like saying, Barack Obama was black, so there's no racism in the United States. There's no white supremacists. There's no neo-Nazis. There's no police violence. There's no, systematic inequality. There's no new Jim Crow. There's no mass incarceration because America elected a black man. And in fact, that was the liberal fantasy of Barack Obama. That absolutely was the liberal fantasy of Barack Obama, that, we've redeemed ourselves and we've overcome our difficult history because we elected a black man. But it's no more true in the United States than it is in the context of Ukraine.
That we published that article that I did about the Azov battalion.
One of our most read articles, by the way, at least in recent years.
Yeah, and it's getting a lot. It's coming back up at the moment quite a lot recently because of what's happening in Ukraine and how Israel was helping them with Tavor rifles for the Azov battalion. I put in the headline and I described them as a neo-Nazi group. But as our colleague Maureen Murphy said recently, there's not really anything neo about it. They're just a Nazi group because there's a continuity there. There's a continuity between, as you described at the beginning of this conversation, the history of the Holocaust and Nazi groups and kind of satellites of and puppet regimes of Hitler's regime.
And it's so, of course, I mean, we know, and it's something we've all written and talked about a lot, the weaponization of the idea of anti-Semitism almost exclusively as a weapon against the Palestine solidarity movement, where even the mildest criticism of Israel will get you branded as an anti-Semite and a Nazi, whereas the same people like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League that allegedly exists to defend Jews against anti-Semitism, is busy whitewashing Hitler's accomplices.
It's infuriating.
That's what's happening.
It is infuriating. And I think this is exactly, I think you're right there, Ali. I think this gets to the heart of why we've been covering Ukraine at the Electronic Intifada over the past few weeks, because it gets to the heart of the hypocrisy about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Yeah. Because, Loki, a British rapper who sings "Long Live Palestine," is branded by the Israel lobby as an anti-Semite, but then literal Nazi group in the Ukraine are branded by those same pro-Israel groups to be freedom fighters defending Mariupol.
Absolutely. And all that hypocrisy is blown open now. I mean, we all saw it in the first days and weeks of this war with, the racist description saying, Ukraine is civilized and European, unlike Iraq, unlike Afghanistan, unlike other countries that have been subjected to.
It was a real masks off moment.
Now everything, Russian is being boycotted and maligned. Whereas, all the excuses that were used for so many years to protect Israel against even the mildest consequences for its actions, its crimes against the Palestinians have all blown up. So it is a masks-off moment, and it is a moment, I think, in many ways, for me, trying to look at this in a longer historical context, where in some ways I think that in the minds of many of the warmongers in the West, they see this as a replay of, or let's say continuation almost of World War II, that a lot of those people never forgave the Soviet Union for defeating Hitler. I really think that there's something to that, because the one of the key ways that the far right in Europe whitewashes the Nazis, whitewashes Hitler's accomplices like Stepan Bandera, is to say what the ADL said, is that, oh, well, for Ukrainians, they're seen as symbols of anti-Soviet resistance, anti-communist resistance. Who was the anti-communist resistance? They were Nazis. They were Hitler's accomplices.
They were explicit about it.
They were explicit about it. So it's in order to, the hatred of the Soviet Union, the hatred of Russia is so strong to the point of allying with Nazis tacitly during the war to some extent in some places, but really explicitly after World War II, when the attention turned from defeating Hitler to defeating the Soviet Union. And you had that interview with Loki on his podcast recently, Asa, where you talked about really Operation Gladio, which was the basically NATO's covert effort to create sort of a stay behind armies. So in the case where the Soviet Union would occupy parts of Western Europe, that these so-called stay behind armies would kick into gear. And these were Nazis that were sort of the people behind these stay behind armies. I've been thinking about why there is this receptivity to Nazism in Western Europe in the 21st century. And to an extent, I think it's because the extent to which the Nazis were integrated into the so-called West post-World War II is not well understood by people. The history that we're taught in schools is that, the good guys won, the Nazis were defeated, they were tried at Nuremberg and they were punished and everyone lived happily ever after.
They completely disappeared.
And they completely disappeared. When, in fact, what happened is that, the West immediately took in, yes, there were trials of top Nazis, and in a way, those trials absolved the West. They're like provide a, I don't want to say scapegoat because those Nazis were guilty, but it was like, we've dealt with all the guilty people, and so, we were free to bring in thousands. The Americans brought in thousands of Nazi scientists. Everyone. It's well known now that the entire Apollo moon program wouldn't have happened without Nazi scientists. But it's even deeper than that. In the 1960s, very few people remember this. Kurt Kiesinger, the Chancellor of West Germany, so the leader of West Germany from 1966 to 1969, had been a member of the Nazi Party. He was a senior official in the propaganda ministry and in the Nazi regime's foreign broadcasting, who worked with Goebbels and von Ribbentrop. He was the Chancellor of West Germany. When the Bundeswehr, the modern German army, was founded in 1955, remember, the Soviets wanted Germany to be neutral, an understandable position after all the trouble that Germany had caused. The Allies, the Americans and their allies, refused, and in 1955, the West began to rearm Germany, West Germany, and founded the Bundeswehr. And the Bundeswehr was staffed by, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of former Waffen-SS officers brought into the Bundeswehr, into the modern German army. So again, Nazis rehabilitated, Nazis brought back in. And I think you see this across the so-called West, certainly in the US. I mean, I think we're living with the legacy of that today.
The target of this kind of normalization of Nazis that we're seeing, it feels like that we are the target of these kind of operations as much as Russia. I mean, a really disturbing example of that was posted last week by a BBC journalist. It was a BBC video. I'm not sure if it went out on the actual BBC TV, but it went out on his Twitter, and it got 1.6 million views on Twitter. This is not a marginal thing. And it was this bizarre video where the BBC journalist Ross Atkins, high production values, but bizarre because it was it looked in depth at the Azov battalion. And it was essentially sort of whitewashing them and saying, well, yes, they have Nazis in their ranks, but it's only 10 to 20% of them that are Nazis. And actually, they're the best fighters. So therefore, you can understand why Ukraine is arming and normalizing them. So this is the real disturbing thing to me that we're seeing. It's this sort of normalization of Nazis in 2022.
The natural thing for Europeans to do is to trade with Russia. They're on the same continent. Russia has massive natural resources, and Europe is, what is it? 40% of its gas comes from Russia. Well, now they've said we're going to cut off all Russian gas, within a few years, maybe sooner if they're not willing to pay in rubles. But we're going to start. They've signed a deal. The EU has signed a deal with the United States to begin importing liquefied natural gas from the United States. First of all, that's not going to happen overnight if it happens at all, because the infrastructure isn't there. And secondly, it's a very expensive process because you have to extract the gas through, fracking or whatever horrible processes they're using in the United States. Then you have to liquefy it, which is an expensive and energy-intensive process, ship it across the Atlantic in container ships, and then deliquefy it on the other end and distribute it. So you have to have all this infrastructure, new distribution networks, terminals, etc. From what I'm not an expert in this field, but from some of the stuff I've read, the American gas will be at least 20% more expensive than Russian gas, which just comes out of the ground and then flows through a pipeline. But this makes the US, makes Europe even more dependent on the United States, even more dependent on NATO and Gladio and all that, because Europe is cutting itself off from its natural trading partner, which would be Russia. And then this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose, depending on your perspective and where you sit. But the freezing of Russian reserves by the West, by so-called sanctions, and by the way, this isn't the first time, because we've seen other official enemies have their reserves frozen or stolen, not least Venezuela, whose assets were stolen by the United States and handed over to the US-appointed so-called president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, but also the Bank of England, which confiscated Venezuela's gold reserves. And the signal that this is sending to countries all over the world is that the dollar and the euro and the British pound are not safe havens that people thought they were, because you put your reserves or your money in a place you think will be safe and secure, and that when you need it, you can pull it out and use it. And what countries are learning instead is that if you put your reserves in British or American or European banks, and then you have any kind of dispute with those governments, they will just steal it from you. And so it is accelerating, I think, the move towards alternative forms of reserves and currencies, whether it's gold or whether it's the Chinese currency or the ruble or whatever it is, to create more independence and to circumvent the global financial and banking systems that since World War II have been completely controlled by the West. It will also probably encourage more trade that does not go through or depend on the West. But let's also be very sanguine that none of this, there's no guarantee that any of these global shifts happen smoothly. and people all over the world are likely to suffer. I mean, even Joe Biden said the other day there's going to be food shortages. Food shortages in the 21st century, global food shortages. What does that mean? What will that mean for people all over the world? What will it mean in terms of political stability and unrest? I mean, how innocent and naive we may have been a couple of years ago, thinking, oh, the pandemic is a big enough challenge that it's going to bring the world together. We're all in the same boat, and we can all see, all of humanity is vulnerable to the same threat. And here we are 2 years later, and this is the situation we're in. It is in the 90s, all the talk was about globalization, and now we have really deglobalization happening. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in many ways. People are talking about a return to more local economies, more regional and sustainable supply chains and agricultural chains. And all of that may ultimately prove to be a good thing. But in the short and medium term, the risks and dangers for the world are immense. And I think it traces back to the unwillingness of the so-called West to let go of its hegemony. They just want, it's like, we have to have it. If we can't have it, we'll smash everything up. And the view that everyone else is a threat. China is a threat. Russia is a threat. Anyone else rising up is a threat. This Manichaean zero-sum view of the world that has been so dominant in the so-called West is just very, very destructive. And, it also comes along with an alarming dose of Nazi whitewashing as well. It took me a long time to unlearn a lot of the stuff I thought I knew.
Yeah.
To a great extent, I was, lived all my life in the so-called West and accepted many of the fairy tales that we were told, and that I grew up in a period when World War II was the dominant cultural narrative or phenomenon, and everything was World War II movies and World War II stories. And it was so easy because it was, it was good versus evil when you look at it in terms of the European continent and Hitler. But the story we were not told and we're never taught was, well, Churchill was Hitler to the people of Iraq and India.
Exactly,
Britain was Hitler to the people of Africa.
Yeah.
Germany was Hitler to the people of Namibia long before Hitler was even born, or when Hitler was in diapers.
Yeah, Belgium carried out a
Belgians in the
Holocaust.
Congo. Yeah.
So the good after World War II, when the so-called good guys won, what were the French doing in Algeria?
Right.
What were the Dutch doing in Indonesia?
Right.
These parts of the story, if you only look at Europe, you can tell a simple tale of good versus evil. When you look at it from a more global perspective, it's not quite such a clean picture. But what I want to say is, it took me a long time to unlearn some of this. I think back to when I was in university at the time of the 1990-91 Gulf War, when it was the same kind of propaganda, it was the same kind of war fever, and we've seen that again and again. We saw it with Yugoslavia in the 1990s, with Iraq again, with Afghanistan, with Libya. Catastrophe after destructive catastrophe with Syria, where the West fought.
There's a lot of parallels between Ukraine and Syria. The moderate
dirty proxy war.
Instead of moderate rebels, we're now seeing moderate Nazis.
Right.
Exactly. So all that is to say that I don't have a magic formula, but I do think that people have to be willing to be skeptical, willing to question, and I acknowledge how difficult it is in this information environment where we are being flooded and bombarded with propaganda. I've never seen the media more propagandistic.
Yeah.
The BBC, which I grew up listening to and used to be, I don't want to romanticize it because it was always, it wasn't ever perfect, but you could rely on it. You could rely on the information, even if it was sometimes filtered through a British or a colonial prism or whatever it was, people trusted the information, and we listened to it for that reason, particularly the World Service. I remember listening to the World Service on shortwave during the 1991 Gulf War. There was no internet at that time. I was a college student in the United States, and the American television was just all, basically cheerleading for the war and propaganda. So if you wanted to know what the Iraqis were saying, to know what the rest of the world was saying, you had to listen to the BBC. And the only way to do that was via shortwave. I still have my little shortwave radio, and I had a huge antenna. I strung wires up around my room so I could get decent. I had all the BBC shortwave frequencies memorized. Early in the morning, you had to listen to this frequency. At midday, you had to listen to this frequency, and so on. When the weather, I knew what weather would give you good shortwave reception. On
Kids don't understand the struggle today. They don't understand it.
These are lost skills.
Yeah.
But nowadays, the BBC is part of the propaganda machine in a way that I've never seen before.
I think it's a lot more crude now. You're right. Yeah.
It's a lot more crude. It's a lot more crude. And that. So where do you turn when we have censorship on social media? We have the governments and their tech oligarchs blocking access to media that they consider disinformation. It's very difficult, and so I just think we have to maintain our skepticism, maintain our questioning, continue to be willing to listen to independent media, and hopefully more people come to have a more critical and thorough and in-depth understanding of the world we live in. And of course, people should read The Electronic Intifada and read some of the articles and resources. I've always wanted to do this, that we're going to link down below.
Also, like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
And donate.
Yeah.